Good morning, students. The derivation of Clasius Mosotti equation. We know the average dipole moment of a single atom, mu bar, that should equals to, that is directly proportional to E local. This mu bar is directly proportional to E local. Mu bar is the average dipole moment of a single atom. And this mu bar is equals to some proportionality constant alpha. So mu bar is equal to some constant alpha into E local, where alpha is the proportionality constant, that is nothing but polarizability. Now let me take the polarization vector. The polarization vector P is equals to average dipole moment per unit volume, mu bar by V, that 1 by V, that should equals to N. So P is equal to N into mu bar. That means P is equal to N into, we know the value of mu bar. Mu bar is nothing but alpha E local. Let it be equation number 1. So the polarization vector at final can be written as P bar is equal to N alpha E local. Let it be equation number 1. Now let me consider displacement vector. The displacement vector is D is equal to epsilon naught E plus P, or that should equals to epsilon E. P is equals to epsilon E minus epsilon naught E. From this epsilon naught E plus P is equal to epsilon E, and P is equal to epsilon E minus epsilon naught E. P is equal to, we know from epsilon R, the value of epsilon R is equals to the ratio between epsilon and epsilon naught. Relative permittivity is equals to ratio between permittivity of medium and permittivity of free space, so that epsilon R is equal to epsilon by epsilon naught, and from this epsilon is equal to epsilon naught into epsilon R. So we can write epsilon R into epsilon naught in place of epsilon. So P is equal to epsilon naught R E minus epsilon naught into E. From this P is equals to, if you take epsilon E common, epsilon naught E into epsilon R minus 1. Let it be equation number 2. So we have derived polarization vector P is equals to N alpha E local, and from displacement vector we have derived the value of P as epsilon naught E into epsilon R minus 1. These two, equation number 1 and equation number 2, are the values of polarization vector P. So if you are equalating these two values, then we get epsilon naught and epsilon naught E into epsilon R is equals to epsilon naught E plus N alpha E local. So these are the two values originated from equation 1 and equation number 2. Now let us divide the entire expression by epsilon naught E. Then we get epsilon R is equals to 1 plus N alpha by epsilon naught E into E local. See, very clear. The entire expression is divided with epsilon naught E. Then we get epsilon R is equals to 1 plus N alpha by epsilon naught E into E local. From this, epsilon R is equal to 1 plus, rearrange N alpha by epsilon naught into E local by E. Let it be equation number 3. But we know from internal field or local field, E local is equals to E plus P by 3 epsilon naught. And E local is equal to E plus, we know the value of P as P is equals to N alpha E local from equation number 1. So E local is equal to E plus, in place of P we can write N alpha E local divided by 3 epsilon naught. And the entire value should send to other side. E is equals to E local minus N alpha E local by 3 epsilon naught from the above equation. E is equal to, if you take it E local common, E local into 1 minus N alpha by 3 epsilon naught. E is equals to E local into 1 minus N alpha by 3 epsilon naught. Now E local by E. Now let me write E local by E. So E local by E is equal to 1 by 1 minus N alpha by 3 epsilon naught, and substitute this equation number 4 in equation number 3. We get epsilon R is equals to 1 plus N alpha by 3 epsilon naught into E local by E term. What is the value of E local by E here? E local by E is equals to 1 by 1 minus n alpha by 3 epsilon naught. Okay, right. From this epsilon r is equals to take 1 by 1 minus n alpha by 3 epsilon naught as LCM. So the expression becomes 1 minus epsilon r is equals to 1 minus n alpha by 3 epsilon naught plus n alpha by 3 epsilon naught divided by 1 minus n alpha by 3 epsilon naught. So here n alpha by epsilon naught in common this say 1 minus n alpha 1 plus epsilon n alpha by epsilon naught into 1 by 3 minus 1, that becomes 2 by 3. So 1 plus 2 by 3 n alpha by epsilon naught divided by 1 minus n alpha by epsilon naught. So this is the value of epsilon r. Now what is the Clasius-Mosotti equation relation? Epsilon r minus 1 into epsilon r plus 2. This is the Clasius-Mosotti equation. So epsilon r minus 1 by epsilon r plus 2 is equals to the entire epsilon r value minus 1 divided by entire epsilon r value plus 2. If we make it calculation, the entire equation becomes n alpha by epsilon naught divided by 3. Okay. So that should equals to epsilon r minus 1 by epsilon r plus 2 is equal to n alpha by 3 epsilon naught. So Clasius-Mosotti equation is epsilon r minus 1 by epsilon r plus 2 is equals to n alpha by 3 epsilon naught. So